To hear the Democrats tell it, the president using his constitutional power is a constitutional crisis. You heard me right. The president using his authority as granted by the Constitution would somehow create a constitutional crisis. I'm referring to the pardon power when it comes to people like Paul Manafort, General Flynn, Michael Cohen, Don Jr., all of those folks. Byron Henry joining me here, constitutional scholar. Byron, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you, Steve.
Let me ask you this. If the president wants to pardon someone, does he have the constitutional right to do that?
Of course, as long as it follows the Constitution. If it's an offense against the United States, meaning a federal crime, the way it stands now, there's no crisis if the president decides to use that power.
So if he wants to hand out a pardon to Manafort, Flynn, Cohen, Don Jr. et al., it's not a constitutional crisis. It's not obstruction of justice. It's not any of those things, is it?
No, of course not. It may be politically questionable since those people have close ties to him and have worked for him, with him, or in his administration. But that's a political question whether or not it's a good idea as for a president to do that who's trying to lead the country and seek re-election and will have to deal with the fallout. That's not a constitutional question.
I think every president has issued pardons that were questionable to some political opponent somewhere. I think every president has issued pardons to people that others questioned and said that was not right, that's not ethical, and so on and so forth. Is that accurate?
That's definitely accurate. I mean, generally the most controversial pardons were reserved for either latent terms or lame duck situations where the president's leaving office. So it's tried to do. They're done in a way that's the least politically dangerous to themselves and or their party. But you're exactly right. Presidents have issued lots of pardons, including people that have worked for them, worked in their administration, or other controversial pardons to donors or to others in the past.
Didn't George H.W. Bush pardon people right in the early part of his first term as president to avoid political problems, and people complain, and yet, so what, right?
I mean, exactly. I mean, it's a presidential prerogative. It is the presidential or executive prerogative, as most governors have the same power under state constitutions. It's a presidential prerogative for whatever reason, whether they think the person was treated unfairly, whether or not they think the person learned their lesson, been rehabilitated. For whatever reason, there's generally no questioning the scope of the pardon power. At least courts have not questioned it in the past. It seems to be very broad, and it seems to be reserved to, as I said, the prerogative of the executive, and it's not really subject to review by court or Congress.
So today we've got a case before the Supreme Court that could become, it could potentially be a precedent-shattering Supreme Court case, and it could reach the White House. And it's a case out of Alabama on a guy who was double jeopardied, right?
That's correct.
By federal and state laws. And I happen to agree that double jeopardy is double jeopardy. If you've been accused and tried by the feds, the state shouldn't get a second bite at that apple. If they don't like the outcome, they should not get a second bite at that apple. My opinion. I don't know which way it's going to go. I'm going to guess it's 170 years of precedent or something. Probably stay the way it is. But I would happen to agree with the assertion that if you've been tried for a crime one time, that's what you get. Am I right or wrong?
Well, first of all, unlike what the media would like you to believe, not every single case or story is about President Trump. And this case has a very slight chance of indirectly affecting the president's pardon power. But the better question, and what you've mentioned here, is can you be tried twice for the same crime? And right now, for decades and decades, the court has held that the separate sovereigns doctrine, meaning if another country tries you for a crime, we can still try you here. If a state tries you for a crime, the feds can still try you for a crime here because they're separate sovereigns. It's been that way for a long time. After listening to the oral argument, it doesn't seem like there are 5 votes to overturn that long-lasting precedent, but it seems if there are 5 votes, it would be a 5-vote cobbled together between a couple of originalists who believe as you do, that the plain original meaning of the Constitution was it doesn't matter whether you're the state or federal government, you can only be tried once for the same conduct, and a couple of the more liberal justices who believe in the individual liberty aspect of the Constitution and the double jeopardy clause. Common sense tells you what you said, so you might be able to cobble a few votes from the liberal side and a couple of votes from the conservative side to get defied, but it didn't seem like there was a big appetite from the justices to overturn this precedent that, as you mentioned, was over 100 years old.
Yeah, it's been there for a long time, but yeah, I go back. I'm going to go with your terms, Byron. The plain meaning of the Constitution: double jeopardy is double jeopardy. I mean, if the federal courts don't like the outcome of the state courts, then they'll just charge you as well. I mean, it's nonsense, is what it is to me.
Well, there's a strong argument that the court just got it wrong as an original meaning sense. So the question could be something like this: let's assume the court got it wrong in the 4 or 5 cases that they've said this starting 170 years ago. Now the question is, and there was a big debate about it, both in confirmation hearings with Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh and in the oral argument, what does the side need to show to justify overturning 170 years of precedent if you assume for the sake of argument that the court was wrong 170 years ago? And it was an interesting argument. How wrong does it have to be? I think Justice Kavanaugh used the word, does it have to be grievously wrong, or is it just enough for it to be wrong? And so that'll be interesting. Whether or not everybody agrees with this, as you say, isn't the question. The question is what do they do about it since it's been on the books for so long? And the government made a strong case that government and law enforcement rely on this. And there's a lot of people sitting in prison today that were tried by the state or the feds afterwards, and do you make this retroactive, and do you let all those people out? So there is some fallout for what the court does here, and it sounded to me like the court wasn't apt to deal with all those consequences and just kind of leave this as is, as binding precedent. But we'll have to wait and see just how strong these justices feel about stare decisis. It'll be an interesting early test for the new justice.
I guess we'll find out in June. Byron. Byron Henry, always a good conversation, great input, and great observations. Thank you.
My pleasure.
There you have it. Byron Henry, everybody. It's the Steve Gruber Show on a Friday. We'll be right back.